Imagine inheriting the greatest empire the world had ever seen, only to turn it into a theater of madness. The year is 180 AD. On the cold frontiers of the Danube, the aging emperor Marcus Aurelius sits in his tent. A dim oil lamp flickers against parchment as the emperor bends his weary body over pages not of war commands, but of philosophy. His meditations, words of discipline, virtue, and the fleeting nature of power flow quietly into the night. He is the philosopher king, a ruler who bears the weight of empire with reluctant wisdom. But in Rome, his son waits. A golden-haired youth named Commodus, the heir to all the power, all the wealth, all the glory of the empire. To the people, he is fortune's child. To Marcus, he is hope for continuity. And yet, Marcus Aurelius's greatest triumph would become his deepest tragedy. For this son would inherit the empire not as a sacred duty, but as a stage. And from that stage, he would drag Rome into darkness. This is not just the story of a cruel emperor. It is the story of how unchecked power, placed in the hands of a fragile mind, can unravel civilization itself. Commodus was a child born into expectation. Tutors, generals, and philosophers surrounded him, each one tasked with shaping him into a ruler worthy of Rome. He was dressed in purple before he could speak, reminded at every turn that one day millions of lives would rest in his hands. But shadows clung to him even in youth. Whispers lingered through the palace corridors, rumors that he was not Marcus Aurelius's true son at all, but the product of his mother's affair with a gladiator. Though unproven, the suggestion gnawed at him. For a boy growing beneath the philosopher's towering shadow, whispers of illegitimacy festered like poison. By 19, Commodus had it all: wealth beyond imagining, the devotion of the legions, the continuity of a dynasty. The Roman people hailed him as a god in the making, but inside was a hollow core, a boy desperate to prove himself divine in the face of whispered doubt. Where his father wrestled with duty, Commodus craved escape. Where Marcus wrote of self-control, Commodus sought indulgence. And where Rome expected a new philosopher king, it received instead a performer draped in royal robes. The crown did not restrain Commodus, it unshackled him. Rome's elite hoped youth would temper with age, that perhaps responsibility might teach him discipline. But for Commodus, power was not a burden, it was a narcotic. He declared himself not only emperor, but Hercules reborn, not as metaphor, but as fact. Across the empire, statues rose of the young ruler clad in lion skin, club in hand, his oiled body sculpted in marble as if he were already a god. And he demanded worship. Senators, once the proud guardians of Rome's dignity, now bent their heads in trembling obedience. They were ordered to chant, "You are Lord, you are first, most fortunate of men." Words of praise spoken with dry mouths, while their eyes brimmed with silent hatred. But for Commodus, these rituals were more than vanity. They were medicine. Each bow, each forced chant, each marble likeness reminded him that he was not a fragile man whispered to be illegitimate. He was Hercules, divine and eternal. Thus, Rome itself became his mirror, reflecting back the fiction he so desperately needed to believe. But worship in marble and ceremony was not enough. Commodus demanded proof, and he sought it in blood. The Colosseum, Rome's temple of courage, became his playground. Draped as Hercules, he descended into the arena, demanding the cheers of tens of thousands. The senators, pale in their white togas, sat rigid as their emperor slew lions already wounded, or gladiators drugged and disarmed. Each staged victory was declared a triumph, each drop of blood a testament to his supposed divinity. The true cruelty lay not in the killings, but in the humiliation. Rome's leaders, men who once commanded armies, were reduced to spectators, forced to cheer as their emperor mocked their traditions. The chants echoed, "You win, and you will win, everlasting conqueror." But the voices were hollow, cracked with fear. Their silence afterward was heavier than the blood-soaked sand. The Colosseum no longer displayed courage. It displayed Rome's shame, and Commodus reveled in it. If the Colosseum was his theater, The palace was his dungeon of desire. Here, Commodus shed even the veneer of rulership. The home of the Caesars was transformed into what observers called a brothel, dressed in purple. Senators' wives were summoned and humiliated. Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred guardians of chastity, were rumored to have been coerced into desecrating their vows. He staged elaborate role plays demanding to be called Hercules, Jupiter, Apollo. Partners, slaves, nobles, even matrons of Rome were forced into violent games of intimacy, their degradation feeding his need for domination. 300 concubines, men and women alike, filled his chambers, but his appetites went beyond even this. At night he prowled Rome's streets disguised, dragging innocent citizens into the palace to be absorbed into his grotesque carnival. For Commodus, corruption was not pleasure alone, it was control. By forcing patricians into servile roles and elevating slaves and gladiators, he inverted society itself. Rome's proudest traditions, the dignity of matrons, the honor of senators, the sanctity of oaths, were reduced to rubble under his hand. The palace had become the empire in miniature, a theater of humiliation, where order itself was rewritten by madness. But behind the silks and whispers, there were victims whose stories are rarely told. In noble households, mothers scarred their children deliberately. Hot irons pressed to soft skin, leaving burns that marred their beauty. Better a disfigured child than one stolen into the emperor's chamber. Some were sent away to distant provinces, hidden from the emperor's gaze. But not all escaped. Their silence, their broken innocence, left wounds that stretched across generations. The Praetorian Guard, too, sworn to defend Rome's emperors, were not spared. Commodus forced them into degrading spectacles, stripping soldiers of their armor and dignity. Men who had bled for the empire were made to kneel, to act as slaves in his cruel theater. They endured, but their loyalty fractured. Their honor had been stained, and vengeance waited quietly in their hearts. Even those closest to him lived in fear. Marcia, his mistress, wielded influence, yet trembled at the fragility of his affection. She knew that imperial love was but a coin that could flip to rage in a heartbeat. Rome's victims of Commodus were not nameless. They were children scarred to survive, soldiers humiliated to submission, women degraded beneath velvet curtains. The empire was not only ruled by madness, it was wounded by it. The emperor's appetites devoured more than dignity. They devoured Rome's wealth. The treasury, carefully guarded by his predecessors, was emptied to fund nights of excess, orgies that lasted for days, amphitheatrical spectacles staged as if the gods themselves were watching. Gold that should have fortified the legions was squandered on silks from the east, perfumes from Arabia, and exotic beasts dragged across continents only to die in the sands of the arena. But even an empire's coffers have limits. When the flow of treasure slowed, Commodus found new ways to feed his hunger. He began selling Rome itself. Military commands went not to veterans of campaigns, but to the highest bidder. Provinces were governed not by competence, but by bribes. Even the consulship, once the pinnacle of Roman honor, was bartered like a trinket in the market. The disease spread. Merchants closed their shops, fearing imperial seizure. Farmers fled their fields to escape crushing taxation. Trade routes grew silent, the lifeblood of the city choked by greed. Rome had always celebrated Romanitas, the shared identity of order, discipline, and justice. But under Commodus, identity itself was auctioned off. The empire was for sale, and each transaction pulled the eternal city closer to ruin. Yet Commodus sought more than wealth. He sought eternity. As Pontifex Maximus, he was guardian of Rome's sacred traditions, but rather than preserve them, he remade them in his own image. The eternal city was renamed Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. The very months of the year bent to his ego, recast with his names and titles. Even time itself was reordered around his divinity. Rituals once solemn and ancient became grotesque parodies. Priests were forced to participate in ceremonies where sacred and profane mingled. Fertility rites turned into humiliating carnivals, marriage rituals into spectacles of degradation. The emperor presided draped in lion skin, club in hand, as Hercules incarnate. Rome's citizens watched in horror as temples became stages for blasphemy. It was no longer Jupiter, Mars, or Apollo who received prayers. It was Commodus. The gods themselves had been replaced. If Augustus had bound Rome together through respect for tradition, Commodus untied the knot with his vanity. The empire was no longer protected by heaven. It was ruled by a man who believed he was heaven. And for many Romans, this was the most terrifying betrayal of all. Even gods can fall, and Commodus's fall began not in the Senate nor in the streets, but in the intimate shadows of his own palace. For years, his cruelty had been endured in silence. The senators swallowed their pride. The soldiers bore their humiliation. The people survived by keeping their heads low. But in the marble corridors of the imperial household, fear was transforming into resolve. Marcia, Commodus's mistress, had long lived in the delicate balance between privilege and terror. At times, she whispered into his ear, steering decisions with honeyed words. Yet she knew, as all in his circle did, that his favor was as fragile as glass, shining one moment, shattered the next. And then came the moment that ended her fear and ignited her fury. She discovered her own name on a list of those marked for death. Beside her name were those of trusted allies: Eclectus, the loyal chamberlain who had managed the palace, and Latus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Commodus, sunk deeper into paranoia, had turned on them all. For the first time, his closest intimates understood. Survival required betrayal. They plotted in whispers, hearts pounding as they prepared to kill the man who claimed to be a god. The plan was simple: poison his wine after his evening bath. But fate is rarely so kind. Commodus, his body still strong despite his madness, vomited the poison back into the steaming water. The god had cheated death once more, and so they turned to violence. They summoned Narcissus, a professional wrestler, one of the emperor's own sparring partners. It was fitting. Hercules reborn would meet his end not in battle, but in a mockery of it. In the humid haze of the bathhouse, Narcissus wrapped his powerful arms around Commodus's throat. The emperor thrashed, gasping, his body slick with oil and sweat. This was the man who had demanded worship, who had renamed Rome, who had enslaved the dignity of an empire. Now he clawed for breath, powerless as the life drained from him. No roar of Hercules marked his end, only silence. And in that silence, the reign of Rome's mad emperor was broken. Rome did not mourn. It exhaled. The Senate moved quickly, unleashing a decade of venom long held back. Commodus was declared a public enemy. His statues were dragged down, his name chiseled from stone. This was damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory, the ultimate dishonor. The months he had renamed reverted to their ancient forms. The city he had called after himself was restored to its rightful name: Rome. His marble monuments, once testaments to his vanity, became rubble at the hands of the people he had ruled. Yet memory cannot be erased so easily. Commodus had scarred the empire. The treasury was in ruin, the army's discipline corroded, the Senate's dignity reduced to ash. Even in death, his chaos lived on. Civil war erupted. The throne was auctioned by the Praetorian Guard. The year of the 5 emperors began, a bloody carousel of ambition and betrayal. Rome had survived Commodus, but it would never again recover the confidence and unity of Marcus Aurelius's age. Erasure failed, but memory endured. For philosophers, Commodus became the symbol of contrast, the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius cast against the madness of his son. For Christians, he was proof that pagan Rome had lost its soul, clearing the path for a new faith. For Renaissance thinkers, he was the archetypal tyrant, the very example used to warn princes of the dangers of vanity and power. But perhaps his most enduring legacy lies not in philosophy or politics, but in psychology. Commodus was not a monster born in full, but a man twisted by insecurity, haunted by whispers of illegitimacy, desperate for validation. His divinity was not faith, it was therapy. His cruelty was not strength, it was weakness sharpened into a blade. He sought immortality, he achieved it. Not in glory, but in infamy. His reign endures as a mirror, reflecting the darkest impulses that surface when conscience surrenders to power. The story of Commodus is not ancient alone. It is eternal. Civilization is not a fortress of stone, but a veil stretched thin over chaos. Rome learned that truth at terrible cost. An empire built on discipline and order was unmade by the fragile psyche of one man. Imagine again inheriting the world's greatest empire. Commodus did, and by his hand, the empire's strength became its weakness. His lesson is ours, that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, that power without conscience is not rule, it is ruin, and that beneath the purple robe of empire, as beneath the suit of modern power, lurks the same fragile human heart, capable of wisdom or of madness. The name of Commodus survives, not as a god, not as a hero, but as a shadow, reminding us that even the greatest civilizations can be unmade from within.